Hello, I'm Mr. Eliason, and welcome to APUS History. Today we're going to do a quick survey across a variety of different Enlightenment thinkers. As we wrap up our colonial period, we need to lay the intellectual groundwork that's going to be essential for the American Revolution, which we're going to dive into next unit. So, today is going to be more of a laundry list of various thinkers and less of a narrative episode, but it happens. Stuff you need to know. Apologies. Let's do it. So we're going to look at key positions and beliefs of Enlightenment philosophers, identify the contributions of Americans to the European Enlightenment, and analyze reactions to the growth of Enlightenment thought. So, as you hopefully remember, prior to the Enlightenment and prior to the whole Renaissance and Reformation thing, most of European society was engaged in this feudal model in which the church was supreme. Relationships between ruler and ruled were very sort of static and relational, and there wasn't a lot of people questioning this philosophy. So, with the rise of the Renaissance and the Reformation, we saw traditional power structures in Europe break down, and people look back to the ancient Greco-Roman political philosophers, build upon their beliefs, and try to create new political philosophies to more rationally explain how the relationship between ruled and ruled, God and humans, and how the world and the laws that operate the universe, to try to codify those in a more rational manner. The first thinker you should probably be aware of is Thomas Hobbes. Serving during the English Civil War, he developed a very negative view of human nature. Quote, "And therefore, if any two men desire the same thing, which nevertheless they cannot both enjoy, they become enemies, and in their way to the end, which is principally their own conservation and sometimes their delection only, endeavor to destroy or subdue one another. Hence, life in the state of nature is nasty, poor, brutish, and short. So, the only way to govern is to confer all their power and strength unto one man, or unto one assembly of men, that may reduce all their wills by plurality of voices to one will." So, people are evil, governments and individuals need to be strong, or else, like in the English Civil War, brother will kill brother over stupid religious and political disagreements, and the countryside will be ravaged. Contrary to this is John Locke's two treatises on government, who, whereas Thomas Hobbes argued that humans are naturally evil and need to be controlled, Locke argued that the position of government should be that, quote, "Since men hope to preserve their property by establishing a government, they will not want the government to destroy this objective. When legislators try to destroy or take away the property of the people, or try to reduce them to slavery, they put themselves into a state of war with the people who can then refuse to obey their laws." Locke's idea here, and his idea of natural rights, the, quote, "life, liberty, and possessions," is what we call the social contract. Basically, that people give power to a government in order to protect their rights. If that government then misuses that power, it's the right of the people to replace or overthrow the government. This is going to become absolutely essential, obviously, once we get into the American Revolution. You should probably also know Voltaire, as he's a French physiocrat and philosopher who wanted to embrace freedom of speech, limit the power of religion, and basically provide more rights, individual rights and civil rights for people. So you should know Voltaire because he's one of the first to be advocating for a lot of these values that we're going to eventually see enshrined in the Constitution through the Bill of Rights. Montesquieu came up with the whole separation of powers thing. You don't need to know his actual name. It's incredibly long, but if you know him as Montesquieu and know that he argued that by dividing up powers, you prevent any one branch of government from becoming tyrannical, should probably know that. And you should probably know some of the economic philosophers. We briefly talked about Thomas Mann when we discussed mercantilism, but he's the guy who articulated that this closed network of trade is the thing that brings in wealth. Yesterday we talked about why I think that's kind of stupid and the downsides to all of this. So the guy who counters this is a guy named Adam Smith, who instead embraced the idea of free market principles, the idea that individuals making free choices create the law of supply and the law of demand. Basically, the law of demand, the more expensive something is, the fewer people want to buy it. The cheaper it is, the more people want to buy it. The law of supply is the cheaper something is, the fewer people want to sell it, whereas goods that are more expensive, more people would sell it to make more money. And where those two lines create an equilibrium, establishing a fair price and a set quantity of this good to be produced and then purchased. As far as the United States, the vast majority of this stuff happened in Europe, of course. Galileo doing his thing, coming up with the scientific method, which is later built upon by Newton and all this stuff. Americans didn't participate in this a ton. We did get the development of inoculation. Puritans, unsurprisingly, the most educated group within the colonies. Puritans did a series of experiments on virulent diseases, eventually coming up with the idea that if you inject someone with just a small amount of a disease, then they'll have maybe a small reaction to it and then be immune or have a less severe reaction once they get infected with once the disease is spreading. And so smallpox was not eliminated, but smallpox outbreaks were cut down on based on inoculation. Obviously, some people were concerned about this and pushed back against this sort of these things, both for scientific and religious reasons. But throughout most of the colonies, inoculation became a common practice. And we've got our friend Ben Franklin, America's founding grandfather, the polymath of Philadelphia, who grew up as a printer's apprentice, published an almanac, and invented all of these fun things, which I'm not going to go into tons of detail about. So he's our quintessential Enlightenment thinker, our Renaissance man, if you will. As a response to all of this, what we saw is the First Great Awakening. The First Great Awakening was a religious movement in Europe that was a response to the Enlightenment in Europe. All of this rationality led some people to push back against religious practices, and religion struck back, as it often does. So instead of focusing on logic and reason, the First Great Awakening focused on emotional reactions, and specifically an emotional relationship with God. These preachers of the First Great Awakening came across the Atlantic and traveled around Europe. George Whitefield, pictured there on the right, traveled broadly across the southern colonies, whereas John Edwards focused on New England. They both preached, again, an individual relationship with God and specifically an emotional reaction to the reality of your salvation. John Edwards' most famous sermon is Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, and it gives a sense of his preaching style. Quote, that God holds you over the pit of hell, much as one holds a spider or some loathsome insect over the fire, abhors you and is dreadfully provoked. His wrath towards you burns like fire, and he looks upon you as worthy of nothing else but to be cast into the fire. There is no other reason to be given that you have not gone to hell, since you have sat here in the house of God, provoking his pure eyes by your sinful, wicked manner of attending his solemn worship. Yea, there is nothing else to be given as a reason why for this very moment you do not drop down into hell. And so in response to this, you were supposed to feel super, super grateful that God, who clearly hates you in your wickedness, is not casting you into hell right now. Some people liked this new preaching style, the emotion of it, the individualism of it, and some people didn't. And so there was a split within religious denominations between the new lights, who, as we said, embraced this new style of worship, and the old lights, who preferred to not be told that they were going to hell and that God hated them. And so these splits led to breaks within denominations, new churches and new denominations were founded, and the end result of all of this is a greater amount of religious diversity within the colonies, and some conflict within congregations. But as it broke the religious dominance of any one group, it basically made it essential that there would be no established religion in any of the colonies, because people disagreed about what religion that might be. This is Phyllis Wheatley's poem about how amazing George Whitefield was. Quote, unhappy we the setting sun deplore, which once was splendid, it shines no more. He leaves this earth for heaven's unmeasured height, and worlds unknown receive him from our sight. There Whitefield wings with rapid course his way, and sails to Zion through vast seas of day. So, after Whitefield's death, a young African-American poet named Phyllis Wheatley composed this poem to him, again showing the broad sort of appeal of the First Great Awakening's philosophy. So that concludes this. When we come back tomorrow, we'll talk about growth and conflict within the colonies as the established power structures break down, and also as England tries to start exerting more control over the colonies. So thank you for listening.